Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to give people a minute or two to join. With that, I'm going to start with a few housekeeping announcements. My name is Sean Smith from MedTech Leading Voice. The housekeeping announcements are number one, the recording and slides will be emailed to all registrants within 24 hours via Zoom. Two, please use the chat function to communicate with me during the session. If you have a question for the speakers, please use the Q&A function. Feel free to add questions to the Q&A function as we go. We're going to try to get to all of them at the end. If we don't get to them, we'll try to follow up with you. Um, let's see. Uh, yeah, the Q&A box is the best place to make sure that the speakers see them. If you would like a certificate of attendance, please put your name exactly as you would like it to appear, along with your email address in the chat, not the QA, the chat. We create those manually, so please give us a couple of days to get them out to you. I'm also going to post a link to a few upcoming MedTech Leading Voice events that are exciting, and I hope you'll join. I also want to acknowledge that we just crossed 8,900 subscribers to MedTech Leading Voice. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe at medtechleadingvoice.com. It's a LinkedIn newsletter, comes once a week. It's also a good place to monitor for upcoming events. We've announced the winners of the MLVX AI MLV 100. Thanks for the 4,000 votes. Now, done with my advertising. So today's session I'm excited about is user critical packaging, 7 decisions that make or break your MedTech launch. Today we're joined by Jenny Collinson, Director of Human Factors Strategy and Advisory at Clarimed, and Connor Franchek, packaging and sterilization engineer at Canyon Labs. I also want to thank Clarimed and Canyon Labs for partnering with us, and our moderators, Sarah and Kelly. Um, in case you're not aware, Clarimed is a human factors and usability consultancy that helps medical device and combination product teams design, test, and validate for real-world use and prove it to regulators. Canyon Labs is a global testing and consultancy partner serving the medical device and pharmaceutical industries with expertise across laboratory testing, consulting, packaging, and sterilization. Today is a practical topic because packaging sits at the intersection of design, usability, risk, sterilization, labeling, handling, and real clinical use. Today's conversation is built around 7 decisions that can affect whether packaging supports a launch or creates avoidable problems late in the process. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the speakers, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sean. Okay, let's get going. So whether you've been in MedTech packaging for 20 years or whether you're completely new to the field, I'm hoping that you'll identify something in this presentation that resonates with you and that you've not really been thinking about. We're not going to recap or lead you through ISO 11607, but we are going to, as Sean mentioned, walk you through 7 specific areas that we see MedTech teams struggle with, and where decisions can either quietly kill a product launch or create a packaging problem that surfaces in the operating room or in use and not in the lab. So we're going to put those real decisions in front of you, the ones that get made in program reviews, in supplier conversations, in risk file reviews, and show you what most teams know versus what most teams miss. And it would be great at this point if you could just drop one word into the chat that describes your biggest current packaging challenge without overthinking it. And we'll come back to those words throughout the session. So if yours comes up, we'll try and call it out. I just want to point out here, I can't actually see the chat. So one of my co-presenters will shout out if they need to highlight anything to me or Connor throughout the presentation. Okay.
All right. So let's start with a number, 13%. 13% of FDA medical device recalls over nearly a decade-long study traced back to packaging and labeling failures. This isn't the device itself, not electronics or the mechanism, not the chemistry, but the packaging. The source of this stat is from FDA's own medical device recall report from 2003 to 2012. And this isn't a vendor commission stat, it's from FDA's data. And here's the thing about that 13%. Yes, this data is from an older study, but that number is almost certainly a floor, not a ceiling. It's likely much higher now. And Jenny, you have a perspective on why that number might actually be understating the problem, right?
Yeah, so I think similar to most sort of data collection from complaints, it only really captures what's reported. So the reality is when packages is hard to open, or peel initiates in the wrong direction, or the label's confusing, users infrequently file a complaint, they adapt, they improvise, and they blame themselves. If a clinician is wrestling with that sterile pouch, and when they finally get it open, they don't reach for an adverse event form or a complaint form. They just move on to the next patient because that's the priority. And the manufacturer probably doesn't hear about it. So that 13% is what surfaces. It's what is probably problematic enough for them to complain about or frustrating enough. But the full picture of usability failures probably aren't being identified. So again, in the chat, if you could type yes or no relating to whether your team's received a formal packaging related complaint in the last 12 months. And if someone could, shout out what that's looking like, that'd be great.
Hey, Jenny, if we're not seeing it in adverse events, where do you think it is being felt or seen with if they're experiencing challenges or confusion in packaging or unboxing?
I suspect it's just been seen in just general frustration and dissatisfaction with that product. And then
so it's probably felt in commercial.
Yeah, ultimately make it commercially unsuccessful. I think we talk a little bit about that later, but I think ultimately that's where these unreported frustrations go. Is it damages your brand reputation?
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting, I was kind of working with Connor on some of the stats here. The stat data set is technically from 2003 to 2012. But Connor and I were talking of, do you think, that is a while ago, but do you think that that's greater or less than it was between 2023 and 2012? My first inclination was it's likely a lot higher than that now. Some of the data that we looked through suggests it's about the same, but I think it's actually, and Jenny, I'm curious to get your opinion on this, but I think it's actually more that you have, what I have seen within usability is you have more regulation, significantly more since 2012 to 2026, and now you're even able to categorize those FDA recalls more intently than maybe in the past that was more broadly like a labeling error or a point of use of opening a package was not intuitive enough. So I guess what's your take on it? Do you think it's gotten higher, lower?
In terms of the stats, I don't really know. I think what I do know is that as human factors has become more embedded in the design and development of products, packaging hopefully will have been included in that, although I think it's sometimes not, hence the reason we're talking about it. So the identification of issues pre-launch hopefully will have increased, which should result in a lower incidence post-launch. I think what I've seen in terms of reporting of issues in general is that it's just not very good. And in particular, clinicians don't like reporting on things that are frustrating that they think might have caused themselves. So if it's packaging, I just think falls into that. It just falls nicely into that category of this is really annoying, but it's not worth wasting my time putting in a complaint.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, there's a big difference also between a complaint and a compliance issue.
Yeah.
There's this works better for me versus this is violating the, necessity of packaging and its performance in the marketplace.
Yeah. Okay, let's move
So looking
on.
at the chat a little bit, Jenny, just to keep you in the loop, there are a lot of yeses. There's decent amount of no's. I think within the yeses, you're getting some feedback on barcoding and labeling and compliance testing for bad barcodes. You're also getting some comments around distributors who think you need to redesign a package, but the customer is complaining about it and not sending devices back in the original packaging. So some reprocessing pieces to it as well.
Yeah, interesting. And some of those are use related. Some of them sound like they're design, like barcoding, incorrect barcoding sounds like it's design related as well. So
yeah.
Okay, let's walk through a scenario. So a surgical team is preparing for a vascular case, and in the sterile field there's a stent, and it's a $15,000 stent. It's in a sterile pouch, as you expect, and the circulating nurse goes to open it, and she's done this hundreds of times with other products, but this peel seal requires more force than expected, and with her gloved hands she can't get hold of it cleanly. So she adjusts her grip, she pulls harder, the seal gives, and when it does, it snaps open fast, and the stent ends up on the floor. The result is the case is delayed for 40 minutes, the stent has to be replaced, the sterile field has to be re-established, and critically, it's highly likely that no formal complaint will be filed, and the manufacturer might not find out, and if it is, it might not give the detail that drives the correct action within that organisation. And interestingly, the engineering team that validated that product probably felt it was ready for clinical use, and they had the seal strength data, the peel force measurements, everything generated in the lab, but they didn't maybe include that packaging as part of a study. They didn't watch it in real use with a real clinician opening it in the correct environment. So I think that what that shows us is there's a huge gap between what gets validated in a lab with peel strengths and peel force and seal strength data, and then what actually happens in real use. And what we're trying to do is close the gap, and that's really what the next 45 minutes is about. It's 7 decisions and 7 places where that gap can open wider, or we can close it.
And I just want to comment that not only is that what the next part of this conversation is really about, it's really why Sarah and I came together to address this problem, because clearly Canyon Lab would provide all of that lab data, right, and help to validate it that way. But we saw a gap and a need that really takes this much further, not only driven from the regulation or the standards, that's one piece of it, but where really we're seeing friction in the industry, and that gap could be closed through this partnership where we're not just looking at the lab data, but we're really understanding the challenges in use and the friction and the risks. But also what I always like to highlight is we talk a lot about risk, but where the opportunity lies, because it is the commercial team that's hearing about this. Really, it comes down to, are people going to buy your products the next time? Is there going to be a different, game time decision to use a different product if the nurse or the technician knows that there's a problem and they don't want to have that same experience be repeated. And so this is, yes, important that we're able to get through the barriers or over the regulatory hurdles, but ultimately this is about how do we build the right products for what's the need in the market, and that we can help you maximize your opportunity in post-launch, not just get to launch.
Yeah, I think the biggest eye-opening thing, Kelly, when we first met and starting to talk to Jenny and understanding, where ClariMed fits and where Canyon fits, I've spent a lot of my career in the packaging engineering world, and I know it's no taboo topic to know that a lot of packaging engineers just design packages in a in a box. They're only looking at the design requirements they have, such as Jenny's case here. They're looking to pass an F88 test, a peel strength test. They're not looking at the nurse that's struggling to open that package. And I think that, through talking through a lot of this webinar and some of the, articles we've done together, I've realized on the packaging engineering side, and we've always had regulations that are pretty vague, or standards that are pretty vague, which we'll go into that later in the talk today. But then you look at the device side, and hearing Jenny talk about, all the requirements and all of the available resource to the engineer that is looking to meet compliance standards, and it's vast compared to packaging. And looking at it from how does this industry advance together? It is that harmony between those, the packaging and the device side. And the closer that those get, I think the higher level of information, guidance, compliance readiness that, a packaging engineer will have by potentially utilizing and learning more about some of the usability guidance that is available more on the device side of things. So I think packaging has a long way to catch up necessarily on the guidance side of things, and packaging is trying. Like, there's a lot, I'll go into it later, but there's a lot on the regulation side that's coming to try to catch up, but the device side is just so much farther ahead than maybe where packaging is or was in the past.
And if I can interrupt for a second, Claramed and Canyon Labs have collaborated on a new white paper. The new white paper is Designing for Safety. If you want a copy of the white paper, just put WP or white paper in the chat. We'll make sure that you get a copy of it after this call. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean.
I think with all that in mind, we'll just quickly skip through these 7 decisions or 7 areas that we're going to walk through today. And I think if you can just, we'll just read them out one by one. And if you could just tell us which one of those resonates with you the most strongly right now, and we'll maybe discuss that later. So the decision 1 is, do you test with the real packaging or with a placeholder, or nothing at all, as many people do?
Decision 2, how do you balance seal strength against gloved hand opening force?
And then decision 3, how do you prioritize things on the labeling, and what gets sacrificed?
Decision 4 is, how do you handle color, symbols, and language when one package ships to multiple markets?
Number 5, when does packaging need to enter and be considered in your risk file?
Decision 6 is, how do you monitor packaging post-market when complaints underreport by design?
Okay, and 7 is, how do you handle packaging changes during manufacturing transfer, or even just design transfers or changes? So that's 7 decisions or 7 areas. Please drop a number in the chat so we can have an idea what you're interested in, and make sure we explore those areas fully as we go through.
You got a lot of 5s and 3s and 1s. A lot of 5s though. 5 is definitely a popular one.
Yeah, 5. I nearly said it, but in danger, I didn't want to bias the outcome. That my favourite would be the risk file, because I think it drives everything else. But anyway, we'll go into that more as we go along. So let's move on. Okay, so the first one, do you run formative HF testing with the real packaging or representative packaging, or with a placeholder? I think what everyone knows is that formative usability evaluation is something that is required, really, as it is. Most people try and include it in their submissions. And it should be with representative users under simulated use conditions. And really what it's doing is de-risking your summative evaluation and making sure you've optimized the design. But I think what most teams don't do or see is that a lot of formative studies are done with either no packaging. It's quite often that packaging doesn't even get included. You just put a prototype of product on the table, packaging is not considered, or using in packaging that's nothing like what will actually be tested in the summative or what will go into the market. And this is usually because the real packaging's not ready, tooling's not committed, final materials aren't locked, and the schedule just keeps moving, and formative testing just gets run with whatever's available, whatever can present that product for someone to look at. And of course, looking at the rest of the design is important, but the packaging gets omitted. So what you can end up with is a summative evaluation that has got an entirely new packaging user interface included, and that can cause issues, unidentified use errors and problems with that summative study. So I'd be interested to know, in your last formative studies, did you have final packaging or representative packaging? Or even if you have given packaging a chance to be optimized during development?
You're getting a lot of yeses.
A lot of yeses. It's great to hear. So, kind of from a packaging engineering standpoint, why do you think people might not include final or representative packaging?
Yeah, I think the reason is sequencing, right? So in most med device, med tech programs, tooling commitments happen after the formative testing on the development timeline. That's tooling for pouches or trays or whichever your primary packaging may be. And packaging engineers are often still evaluating materials, geometry, configurations, when the human factor team needs those actual samples for a study. So the human factor team gets what's available, what exists. That's maybe a pouch that's roughly the right size, a tray that's approximately the final geometry, maybe a label that somewhat mimics the content, and everyone's saying that's close enough. And the problem in that is that close enough is not the same as representative. So peel force is a function of the actual seal geometry. The opening dynamics depend on the actual materials utilized. Those characteristics are not close enough. They are either correct or they're not. And placeholder packaging cannot give you that right answer. So I guess, Jenny, what does doing this right actually require from the program schedule?
I think it's just really getting people involved earlier. So getting the packaging team involved earlier and having a really good idea of what you want that packaging to look like. Because actually involving packaging, just involving packaging as part of the overall system design, it just, you put it into the risk file, we'll discuss that in a minute, but and you have chance to optimize that design and minimize any risks. And it's not just, the other thing that we didn't talk about really on this slide actually is there's also labeling to consider here. So what does that labeling design look like? Often there's labeling on there that's controlling risk. So that also gets time to be optimized. So I think it's just about getting packaging artworks as early as possible, knowing what needs to go on that packaging, knowing how it needs to be designed to present that product in a safe way. So it sounds simple. I know it's not, because everyone's focused on what's inside the packaging. Let's get that right, and then we'll deal with that packaging later. But you don't want to be that to be the place where your product fails at the last minute.
Jenny, I'm curious where you guys get customers in their launch cycle, and I'll explain the impetus of my question. But I think especially on the packaging side, like if you're trying to meet ISO 11607 Section 7 regs, on the packaging engineering piece, for all intents and purposes, I see most of our clients designing their package, and then they're doing, the assessment at the end just to check the box of like, I have my perfect package. Maybe it's not perfect for my user, but it's perfect for me. And I'm just sending it through this usability testing, thinking it's going to pass and I'm going to move on. And, you mentioned something very important, the vital shift that is needed in this in the design and marketplace is the ability to iterate based on, usability data. Connor mentioned some of the roadblocks to that being tooling, and packaging is very expensive. It's very hard to get prototyped at times. There's a lot of roadblocks. So I get why you might see more no's than yeses at times. But I'm curious, I guess, from your guys' perspective, typically speaking, where in the life cycle are you getting people? Are you seeing more people thinking about it more upstream, especially given that, you guys have some of the device side too? Or are you noticing some of the same maybe bad trend that we see in the packaging side, where it's I did my thing, check my box, here you go?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say because obviously all companies are different, but I think what we do see is a lot of people not having quite finalized packaging earlier in the development process. So they've not even got an idea of it sometimes. They're bringing us a prototype, but it's not, we don't even start looking at the tasks until it's out of the box.
Yeah.
Of course, when we come to, doing someone's formal summative evaluation, that all we would consider everything. But at that point, we don't know what work's been done with that packaging beforehand if we haven't had the project from the start. So
Yeah.
It just depends, when we receive or when we start working on that project. And I think if we were aware of projects early in their development, then we would probably highlight it. Because I always, the first thing I say is, have you got a use-related risk file? And if it doesn't start from the beginning and it hasn't got the packaging in there, then that would be something that we would flag. But we don't always have, we don't always see the products that early in their development.
Yeah.
I was going to jump in there
ahead.
too, Sarah. I think, just like what you guys see, we see a lot of, okay, we need to do this, check the box, whether that's packaging or the device. And what we continue to try to educate on is that this should be an iterative process. This isn't a one-time thing if you want to optimize it and you want to, first de-risk your regulatory success, but really optimize that experience for the user and balance that innovation curve with risk management. So we do see a lot of clients come in at the last minute, and what we continue to encourage is involving us earlier, which I realize can be challenging, both from a project management as well as from a cost standpoint. But involving us earlier can actually save time and money and help you develop a better product. And I think that applies to packaging and the device itself.
Someone wrote a comment in that it resonates. And she said, I often find that no one cares about packaging until everyone cares, which is usually happens after a failure. And that, Catherine, that hits home.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So the next decision 2, this one's one of my favorite. I know Jenny, you like 5, but this one's good on my packaging engineer standpoint. How do you balance seal strength against gloved hand opening force? So what most teams know, seal strength is validated against different standards, ASTM, and you have a minimum seal strength requirement based on your sealing process characterization work. You have a test method, you have data, good to go, green light, we're set. What most teams don't see, a package can pass every seal strength test in the lab and still produce contamination, device damage, or improvised opening techniques in clinical use. And the competing constraint, the force that gloved hands can reliably generate is real. And the lab is not the place where that constraint gets resolved. The problem there is that ASTM test methods use controlled equipment to grip and separate that seal. And that's not how a clinician opens a package, right? A clinician is in surgical gloves, often in a time-pressured environment, uses friction, finger dexterity, and body mechanics even that are completely different from the test apparatus that we're testing in the lab. The peel force you're package requires in the lab and the peel force a gloved user can generate are two different numbers. And most teams, are not considering that gap. So I guess, Jenny, from your perspective, what do you actually see clinicians doing when that seal strength, is hard, or that seal is resisting?
Yeah, whatever they can to get in the package, whatever comes to hand. I think I've observed just ripping the package, not using the opening method, just ripping it in whatever way possible, which of course risks damage to the product inside. Scissors are an obvious one. You could end up cutting something internally. I've even heard of people using their teeth, which is frightening from a risk point of view. And like we just mentioned on the stent example, that if you have to use a lot of force, you run the risk of losing the product inside, if you don't have controlled opening. So I think, back to my favorite number 5 that we'll deal with soon. I think if you've identified those as risks in your risk file, then it helps you design that product correctly, and you know what to look for and how to design tests. And of course, for me, a lab test is more around having a specification and controlling to that specification with materials once you understand what's the right force that meets the user's requirements. So I think don't just consider what the equipment's telling you. Like Connor said, you have to look at what people do as well.
Mm-hmm.
I know we have a lot to cover, but the only other thing I'd mention was some seal strength and just gloved hand opening. The other thing that a lot of people don't consider is maybe the aseptic technique that someone will likely use for the opening of their package. Like you have your controlled and dump, you have your open and present, you have all these different opening methods. And I'm doing some work in the industry right now with the Kilmer group that is trying to tie packaging types to aseptic opening techniques. And so you're looking at truly from a ideal sense of not having hospital-acquired infections. So you're trying to minimize the opportunity for bacterial transfer. What is the ideal opening technique for, say, a pouch or a tray, and depending on the size and length and different parts of that tray. So I think in addition to glove handling, also try to think about and consider how a end user is going to open it from a aseptic presentation technique perspective.
Yeah, perfect. And that is definitely one of the things that, is problematic in usability studies, is keeping things sterile.
Yeah.
Okay, so label hierarchy. It's a very interesting one. So I think what we all know is there's lots of things need to go on labels. So product name, size, expiration, dose, sterility status, new MDR requirements, UDIs, and then other relevant regulatory symbols. There's just some things that just have to go on there. But I think what is difficult is prioritizing those symbols, especially if there's things that need to be communicated that are critical. So how do you make something stand out if it's really important in amongst all that other information that has to go on? I'm just interested to know how many distinct pieces of information appear on the front of people's primary packaging. I think it's probably difficult, but for you to determine when you're on a call, but I guess would be fine, or even just comments around how cluttered packaging looks. Connor, you probably know a little bit more around what's creating this labeling crowding from a regulatory point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so several things are converging here. You have EU MDR requirements expanding those labeling requirements significantly. UDI mandates, the multilingual requirements for global packages add language blocks. There's, the symbols need to be present and correctly sized. So each of these requirements comes from a legitimate regulatory rationale, but they all land on the same square couple of inches of label real estate. And no single requirement is is the villain per se. It's, the collection of all of them. And the only way to manage that is through that deliberate hierarchy design, and not through trying to fit everything in the same font, at the same size. So that's the solution there.
Yeah, I think the key is how you prioritize, and back to my favorite subject again, which is look at the risk file early. What's the important pieces of information that need to be prominent and visually prominent on that labeling, and how do you communicate those effectively and get those in front of the end users to check that labeling resonates with them. I think that's the only way to do it, and I think leaving packaging and labeling till very late in the development process doesn't allow you to do that, and puts launch at risk. And then if you happen to get through the summative evaluation with that, then obviously it's putting users at risk as well if it's not clear. Okay, and then on a similar note, really, the decision 4 is about handling colour, symbols, and language when one package ships to multiple markets. I think we all know that international labelling requires translation and compliant symbols. But what some people probably don't know is that colour semantics aren't universal. So red is a colour that signifies danger in the US and could signal good fortune in parts of China. So you can see how that might be problematic. And then if you test symbols in one cultural context, it might not be recognised in another. So there's multiple examples of where symbols just don't have the same meaning in one location as they do in another. And then back to things being legible. If you have multiple languages on packaging, which you need to for MDR certainly, it can become practically illegible on the labelling, especially for very small packages. I mean, I don't know whether people know how many languages they're currently putting on their packaging. I imagine it's quite a wide range depending on target markets, but it'd be really good to know. But kind of from a packaging engineering standpoint, what does this mean for the physical design of the packaging?
Yeah, it means geometry matters enormously. So a package with 8 required languages in a fixed label area is going to make trade-offs, right? So sometimes that trade-off is font size, sometimes it's the size of the symbols, sometimes it's removing the product illustration that actually helped clinicians orient the device. And the way to avoid this being a last-minute compromise is to design early and design for the most constrained market first. So if your labeling requirements for the EU plus your language requirements for Asia Pacific fit cleanly on the label, the US version is easy. And if you design for the US and then retrofit everything else, you'll essentially run out of room. So, like I said, early in those constrained markets first.
Okay, great. Do we have any feedback, Sarah, on how many languages?
I mean, I'm more on the symbol side of things. I mean, I remember when everyone was working on redoing the symbol usage behind sterile packaging, and there was this huge debate. This had to be 2016 now, but this huge debate on like if you have a dotted line or like a dashed line or a solid line, and how that fits into dual or single barrier symbols. And their whole shtick of having this argument was trying to make it universally understood, regardless of language, country, wherever. And so I don't know. I think about it more from a symbol perspective. To me, I don't know. I'm curious how labeling will evolve over the next 10, 20 years. I mean, I see, IFUs are already going away. It's all eIFUs pretty much going forward. I think the next piece is you're going to have some AI thing that teaches you how to do it in real time, and you'll have some cool little video camera thing. I think the same with labeling. I'm curious when it'll just become like a scanned barcode or something that tells you exactly what you need to know in whatever language you need. And it's not this, legibility problem, or, a thing that you're looking at square footage on your package that you have room for this label. I think the conversation will change a lot in the next 10 years with just the way technology.
Yeah. I think it needs to, because I think there's just a bit of a direct conflict between human factors engineering, making those products safe for the end user, and getting the information on that the regulations currently require. So something needs to move, doesn't it? It's very hard at the minute.
Yeah, I mean, IFUs scare the heck out of me. If my doctor's reading the IFU before he sticks this thing in me, like I'm out. I don't want anything to do with that. So we got to evolve.
Okay, my favorite. When does packaging usability enter the risk file? Well, as early as possible, really. So we all know that use risk analysis is part of the HF process. It's required through 14971. It's referenced in FDA guidance. There's no choice in doing it. But I think what often happens, as we mentioned earlier, is that packaging risks are identified very late and without a lot of granularity. So often when I review a risk file, there'll be nothing related to packaging. The tasks will start with using the actual product that's inside the packaging. Or if it's there, it'll be something very, very generic, like package difficult to open, which doesn't really help. So it doesn't really include the specificity that a regulator reviewing an HF file would expect to see. So I think what needs to be included as early as possible are some real packaging hazards, such as sterile field breach, selection error. I think that's super important for dosing, doses of drugs and things. Device damage, contamination due to packaging debris, all sorts of packaging things that need to be captured in the file. And then some realistic severity and probability assessments to ensure that they're driven as a priority as part of design decisions. And like we mentioned earlier, it's usually timing related, why they're not there. No one's really thinking about the packaging when they're developing the product at the early stages. It's sort of, you need to have a product on the table to design a package for. And so there is a bit of a timing conflict, but I think the use risk analysis needs to incorporate it as early as possible, even at a basic level at the beginning of the project, and then it develops as the packaging becomes realised. Because I think sometimes it just gets put in as placeholder, a single line, and then never gets filled out because it's a last minute thing. And I think it's likely to start generating more and more questions from regulators as they become more educated in what can cause the risk to the end user as well from the product, because it's not just the product, it's the whole system around that product development. So, Connor, do you have any thoughts on what could be done differently to help close the gap?
I think just having a packaging engineer in the room when that use-related risk analysis is being written would be huge. Not just contributing a test report after the fact. Obviously, that's important, but the hazards that come from, say, material properties, from seal geometry, from dimensional tolerances, those require packaging expertise to identify correctly. And if the risk analysis is written without that expertise in the room, then the packaging risks will be incomplete, essentially.
And you guys received a question in the chat that said, don't the RMF lines roll automatically out of the customer requirements and the system requirements of which most projects start?
Yes, but not everyone has that level of control in their product development. We're considering here people who start in very small companies that don't have these very formalized development processes in the same way that a large company would. So yes, some companies will have this completely controlled. They'll develop the documents in the right order, and they'll have they'll have automated or manual ways of linking things together. Other companies don't have that. It's much more ad hoc than that.
Jenny and Connor, I'm seeing a few questions around, small companies. A lot of companies don't have a specific packaging engineer, and what to do in those cases. It's either following on the main project engineer, or not getting adequately addressed, and maybe both.
Yeah, I mean, I think really the key, like I mentioned about it, is just is getting the risk management right, because actually, if you identify what the risks relating to packaging could be, then when you go to design the packaging, you know what you're looking for. And I think there's certain key things that need to be included in that risk file. I appreciate not everyone has a packaging person, but there will probably be a packaging person at the place that you're getting the packaging designed. So maybe involve them early, to get that feedback.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, Jenny, is speaking with your suppliers if you don't have a packaging engineer of your own. That's a great way to start. They absolutely have knowledge of the materials. They like if it's a tray that's being sealed, they'll understand sealing as well. So that's someone you can discuss that with.
Yeah, I'd say we have a whole packaging consulting team at Canyon Labs who could give us a call if you need one on a temporary basis. I think, when you look at packaging consultancy in general, I think it is a newer trend for companies to have full-time packaging engineers, and newer meaning last 10 years. Prior to that, to everyone's point here, the fickle need for a packaging engineer is peaks and valleys. It's really high at certain points and then it's non-existent in others. So I think that's really been the birth point of packaging consulting and packaging engineering degrees, has been, fulfilling that void, if it's only temporary. So
I think that's the same that falls within usability and HF. Do believe it should be integrated, but it is iterative and certain points in time. And I think, this earlier stage where you're leaning on packaging engineering, like that's a good time for us to come in and do kind of an expert review, and provide some input to what the user might experience and how that might play into your risk file. And so, it's about what does the effort look like at what point in time and how robust does it need to be, but not getting the information, and going ahead and designing and developing with that early input is where you increase your risk.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right. So decision 6. How do you monitor packaging post-market when complaints underreport by design? So what most teams know, complaint trending is the primary post-market signal. You track complaints, you trend them, and you act on those spikes. What maybe most teams don't see is if packaging complaints underreport systemically, and they do, as Jenny described earlier, then complaint trending is measuring just a fraction of the actual packaging failures. And you can have a packaging problem that is costing you clinical accounts that never registers as a complaint. In practice, the first signal that packaging is failing clinicians is often maybe a business signal. That could be a drop in sales in a specific account, a lost contract renewal, maybe a field sales rep hearing we're looking for alternatives. Those are packaging usability signals that will never show up in your complaint database. So I guess in the chat, maybe you can put, has your team ever surveyed clinicians specifically about packaging performance? Yes or no?
1 yes and 2 no's thus far. 3 no's.
Yeah, I would think mostly no is across the board is what I would guess. And this means most of us are monitoring a signal that by design misses most of what's actually happening. So what does proactive monitoring look like? This could be structured in-service observations, clinician interviews at field sites, and not just asking, was the packaging okay, but asking specific questions, about opening force or label clarity and how often they are improvising during that process. They are, the minimum viable surveillance for a use-related risk. So I guess, Jenny, from your perspective, from a human factor standpoint, what does a good clinician feedback mechanism look like?
Well, I think what it's not, is a generic satisfaction survey. Clinicians often will say, "Oh, it's fine," because they've adapted to it and they've developed a workaround. I think you actually just need to go and ask or observe specific tasks, such as peel initiation, label readability. Look at how it's being utilised in its actual clinical environment, and then ask, what they do if it doesn't work as they expect, or and get that feedback. I think you're really looking at behavioural questions and not opinion, because that's really what you're trying to get to for improvements. Right, I'm just going to skip forward really quickly because I'm aware we're running out of time, actually. So let's go on to decision
7. How do you handle packaging changes during manufacturing transfer? So, what most teams know, manufacturing transfer requires revalidation against design specifications. There's gates, documentation, sign-offs. The process exists. And what most teams don't see is peel characteristics, seal geometry, and dimensional tolerances can drift within engineering specifications while the user experience changes dramatically. And this is the, silent degradation problem. And here is what that looks like in practice. So your original site uses a specific sealing bar geometry and a specific film lot. Your new site uses equipment that is within spec. Peel force numbers are in range, seal width is in spec, the dimensions pass, but the opening dynamics are different. The peel initiates differently. The way the package presents the device changes. And if you have not done a usability comparison with representative users, you will never know. The clinical performance of a package can degrade across a manufacturing transfer that passes every gate, mentioned earlier. And the thing about that is no complaint will be filed, no recall will be triggered. The users will adapt. That word's come up a number of times in this presentation. And your market share will erode in ways you won't immediately be able to attribute to packaging. The right answer is either a retest with users at the transferred configuration, just being a simulated use evaluation, not just physical testing, or an explicit documented judgment that the packaging user experience is unchanged. And most teams do neither. They do physical testing and sign the transfer package off. And I guess, Jenny, is there a regulatory expectation here that teams may not be aware of?
Well, I think in reality, most teams will be aware that, the process of change control requires them to consider whether they're making an impact to their validated product. And what you're really looking for here is changes that could affect use-related risk, and of course a manufacturing transfer could, or any sort of change to the product design. So you need to assess whether the usability data that you've generated is still applicable to that new design. I'm not sure many change control processes actually ask that question. And they'll ask whether the physical performance characteristics are impacted. But like we mentioned earlier, they're physical performance characteristics. So maybe if you've gone from the top end of a spec to the bottom end of a spec, or there's slight geometry change, then it might really impact the way someone interacts with the product, and that just needs to be considered.
All right. So we wanted to look, I said earlier, we'd look at some of the, rules and regulations that go and guidances around packaging. So some of the kind of evolution of usability, it originally got introduced to packaging standards. The, holy Bible of sterile packaging is ISO 11607. In 2019, they added Section 7, which brought usability into the mix for the first time ever. 11607, you had transit, aging, seal integrity testing. You never before had consider the end user. You had everything considering the manufacturing process and the validation process of ensuring it gets to the end user safely. So this was the first time you took it beyond getting to the end user and actually being in that end user's hands. In 2023, an amendment was added to 11607 for Section 7 to just add more direction. And then the AMI TIR 16775 came out alongside the Section 7 piece, but it has been reiterated recently to add more risk assessment language in there, so you can really work and use that as a guidance on how to assess the usability of your package. And again, the added element of your risk assessment. And then some new things happening in 2026. There's actually 2 working groups within ASTM right now that are working on. One is working on an actual method that is trying to help you have a test to do an R&D as a quick down and dirty to get some, user feedback within the design process, very early on in the design process. And then the other group that's mentioned here was trying to add more of guidance around how to test specifically for packaging. And that ASTM was actually just put out to ballot. So that will hopefully be coming out in the coming months, which is great. So I think one of the questions we had was, has your team had Section 7 question come back on a submission in the last 18 months? I will say when Section 7 came out in 2019, I feel like it was this kind of like light suggestion. It was like the should, shall, argument that you get in standards a lot. And I've seen it, much more prevalent in FDA feedback within the last, 3 to 4 years.
So as we're
sorry, Sean, go on.
So as we're wrapping things up, I do want to call attention to a very special offer from Clarimed and Canyon Labs with Jenny and Connor. It's an opportunity for you to speak to them about what you're working on. No obligation, but we are looking for up to 15 companies that want to take advantage of this packaging vulnerability review. If you could advance a couple slides. I think that we have a slide about this. And yeah, you're also going to get a packaging program self-assessment. If you write self-assessment in the chat, we'll send that. But type PVR for a chat with them. Yes. So I wanted to make sure that I got that in before the end. Now you can go back to talking because I wanted to interrupt.
Okay.
No strings attached, 30-minute conversation. If you don't have a human factors expert or a packaging engineering expert, here's your 30 minutes to get some opinions from some.
Yeah. And I think, we are approaching the end of the session, but I think, it'd be nice just to go over the next couple of slides, just because it sort of talks about why and what good looks like, and then, we'll go through them as quickly as possible. But and this slide just really, it shows this curve, which is the same for most design issues. I think what makes packaging uniquely vulnerable to costing a lot of money at the end of programs is it gets addressed latest. So often after the device design's locked and after the risk file's written and the formative studies are complete. So by the time you find the packaging problem, you're always on the expensive end of this curve. But looking at it and iterating it at concept stage costs virtually nothing. Cost of iteration during early development is relatively, good value. Once you get into tooling commitment, then you're into, a hugely expensive cost if you want to then change packaging design, tooling for a thermoform tray or a die cut pouch. It's just much more expensive as you move up the curve. Connor, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, not too many extra details. I'll just add some numbers. So with tooling, that can be 3 to 6 months, timeline there. So the cost of a formative study with real packaging at the right stage of development is a rounding error compared to that 6-month launch delay.
Yeah, and that just leads directly on to just what does doing it right look like across the product life cycle? And of course, phase one is concept and early development. So do some contextual inquiry, get out into clinical environments and watch how packaging actually gets used. Don't ask clinicians what they want, watch what they do and design products that work with that. Watch where they hesitate, improvise, adapt. And this is where you can write packaging usability requirements and ensure you design that packaging right. And if you're referencing clinical observations as part of your packaging requirements document, then I think that reflects that you're doing things right. And then phase two is design iteration. So make sure that you are testing or evaluating with real packaging, looking how people interact with that packaging. Make sure you run that in parallel with performance testing so that you can align them. Like I mentioned earlier, the spec is how you control the good performance with a user, and make sure that you are comfortable with the design and the design in the hands of the end user before you close that design iteration loop and before you commit to tooling. So you're doing it right when formative study results influence your packaging design and that you're including packaging as part of that human factors process. Connor, do you want to quickly skip through 3 and 4?
Sure. Yeah. Phase 3 is verification and validation, and this is where summative usability evaluation happens. Coordinated with packaging validation, not sequenced after it. So you're doing phase 3 right when your summative protocol was written with input from both human factors and packaging engineering. And on the other hand, you're doing it wrong when the packaging gets tacked onto an existing device study as an afterthought. Another common theme. Phase 4 is transfer, launch, and post-market. This is where proactive monitoring happens. Structured clinician feedback, field observations. If something changes in your packaging, whether that's materials, manufacturing site, the question, does our usability data still apply? That needs to be asked and answered with evidence. And you're doing this phase right when your post-market surveillance has a packaging specific section and with specific monitoring activities, and you're doing it kind of wrong when your only post-market signal is complaint trending.
Yeah, okay. That's very, very, again, that's common for all post-market data monitoring. Looking at things proactively is always an improvement. So I think Sean just presented these 2 slides, so I don't think we need to go over them again. And I actually don't think we really have time for any questions.
No, we're a little bit over, but I want to thank the 4 of you for your time today and sharing this information with us. Everyone, look forward to the white paper in your inboxes, Designing for Safety. It's a fantastic white paper. I just read it. And I want to thank the audience for giving up an hour of your time, an hour and 5 minutes at this point. So thank you very much. If your panelists would like to say goodbye, we're going to sign off. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
your time.
Thank you.